By chance, as Sen was busy slaying mantises and reveling in his bloody success, another hunter approached Zephyr Valley. Unlike Sen, however, Tobias West was not having good fortune at the moment. Not a single mutant creature. I've been out here for weeks and not one. Miss Aaron is going to have my head if I come back after all this time with nothing to show for it. Tobias worked for Sarah Aaron, the same Sarah Aaron that Sen embarrassingly stabbed in the butt. He arrived in God's Sanctuary a few months ago, just after he had graduated from an elite private school. He learned that to rise up quickly in Steel Armor Shelter, getting close to the elite warrior was the fastest way, and Tobias was very impatient to evolve. To him, evolving was a means to an end. He had a privileged upbringing. His parents were the owners of a powerful interstellar shipping conglomerate, and were highly regarded as distinguished aristocrats. Throughout his life, all the things Sen had to fight for were simply handed to Tobias. But with these gifts, and in the shadows of his famous family, he felt immense pressure to distinguish himself. To stand on his own and accomplish something great, he needed to max out on mutant geno points and become an evolver, or his self-imposed shame would eat him alive. There were two classes of title within the Levo Interstellar Alliance: distinguished and aristocratic. Surpassers became distinguished, but you had to be an evolver to be an aristocrat. The rewards were worth it. There were financial benefits, sure, but Tobias would never want for money. The true value of a title was the social status it granted you. Nowadays, one could hardly get a meeting with a member of the upper class if you didn't have at least the distinguished title before your name. At first, Tobias assumed he could simply buy his way to success. He had brought a significant sum of money to Steel Armor Shelter, but he was sorely mistaken. Money could only buy him the meat of ordinary and primitive creatures, as mutant flesh was hardly ever sold. People strong enough to hunt mutant creatures generally kept the loot to themselves. Only incredibly strong and ambitious individuals like Sarah Arin, who were working towards evolving using sacred geno points, would occasionally sell their mutant creature flesh. But Sarah Arin wasn't interested in money. She wanted loyalty and service. Tobias hated paying with loyalty and service. But there he was, trudging back to the Steel Armor Shelter, empty-handed. He risked his life for her scraps. On a good expedition, he would find and track a valuable creature. He would send word back to Sarah, who would organize a hunting party and set out and take the beast down. And then he would get a cut. This trip, though, was a total waste of time. There were few things that Sarah hated more than people who wasted her time. One of those happened to be Olsen Assfreak Hahn. Tobias was about to step into the valley, very aware of the danger. There are lightning mantises here. If I get my head chopped off after wandering around out here for a month without bath or a hot meal, or even so much a hint of a mutant beast, I'm gonna be super pissed. He thought about doubling the length of his trip by going around the valley when he heard an unusual sound in the distance. Come and get me, you weak-ass bitches! Tobias pushed into the tall grass and looked out into the middle of the valley where he spied Sen going berserk, slaughtering mantises. He counted to himself. 7, 8, 9, holy crap! He could barely keep up. 15, 16, 17, who is that? 20, 21? Finally, Sen wrapped up his bloodbath. 43 mantises, according to Tobias's count. There was green, gooey blood everywhere. Tobias moved closer, and when he got past a particularly high shock of grass, he saw it. A giant pile of green carcasses. Slain swift mantises, at least a dozen of them. And heroically standing over them, clad in his shining golden armor, Sen marveled triumphantly. Who is this fearsome warrior? Tobias tentatively approached the Golden Knight. His eyes kept flicking back towards the massive pile of mantis bodies. They still oozed green blood. A small pool was gathering at Sen's feet. Tobias was shocked that any one person could kill all of them so quickly. In his experience, the deadlier the creature, the longer it took to kill it. He had personally watched as a new recruit to the Sons of Heaven gang had slashed ineffectively at a copper-toothed panther for the better part of an hour. The monster effortlessly ducked his blade until the recruit tired, at which point the beast pounced and ripped the poor kid to shreds. The lightning mantises of Zephyr Valley made the copper-toothed panthers look positively sluggish by comparison. Even those who had already maxed out their primitive geno points tended to avoid them. The mantis was just too dangerous for the average person to risk injury or death, especially when there were other less dangerous primitive creatures you could hunt. That's why the hunting grounds for creatures like copper-toothed panthers were so competitive. The safer bet attracted tons of people to their areas, so you were lucky if you could bag more than one while you were there. And that's if a gang wasn't camped out there, intimidating all the competition to look elsewhere. Sen noticed Tobias approaching and waved him over. "Hey you, interested in making a purchase?" Sen had actually just wondered what he was going to do with all these mantises. He had gotten caught up in the moment and gone on a killing spree, but there was no way he could eat them all, and even if he could, he would only make it through a few before they stopped granting him geno points. And he couldn't carry them all back. Maybe this odd young man who just came out of nowhere could help by taking some off his hands. Tobias approached the pile and cautiously lifted a limp mantis claw. "How much?" Sen hesitated, as if he hadn't thought this far ahead, as if he didn't know how much a mantis was actually worth. 1,000 levo dollars. Tobias held back an excited breath and tried not to show his excitement. This guy with golden armor may be a powerful warrior, he thought, but he's a terrible merchant. I would have asked for much more. At least then it would give him some leverage to haggle. It's like he doesn't even want them. Even though primitive creatures were common prey, their meat was always in demand as more and more people arrived in God's sanctuary and wanted to buy their way to quick geno points. That demand was even higher for creatures like lightning mantises, which were rarely hunted and would still grant most people geno points. Variety was extremely important in God's sanctuary, since eating the same creature too many times had diminishing returns. This led to people seeking out more and more new sources of the precious geno point producing creatures. And, as in any world, the well-off will pay top dollar for high-demand items. Tobias did a little math in his head. I could sell these things for 2,000 or 3,000 each easy. If I can get these back to town and sell them off, this trip will actually be pretty productive. Of course, I'd still have to deal with Miss Arin, but that's a problem for another time. Then it occurred to him, wait, maybe there's something wrong with them, and that's why this guy is selling them so cheap. That would explain how one man killed all of them. Tobias responded, You're sure? 1,000? Now it was Sen's turn to hide a smile. He actually did know exactly what lightning mantises were worth. He also knew that there was no way for him to transport them all back to the steel armor shelter without some sort of wagon or companions to share the load. And if he chose not to sell the mantises to this man and transported them back in multiple trips, who's to say the man wouldn't just steal them? God's sanctuary had no laws, after all. Deals were built on respect and self-preservation. Sen nodded. Tobias took a closer look at the mantises. Everything seemed to be in order. Sure, I'll take all of them. How many are there in total? He already knew, since he'd counted every kill in real time. But he wanted to see if Sen pumped up the number. Then he would know that this guy was unreliable, and there probably was something wrong with the mantises. 43, but I'll give you a discount and only charge 40. Sen didn't think the man would have enough cash on him to pay much more than that. And he wanted to knock this deal out here and now. Tobias took out his wallet and counted, and Sen could plainly see he underestimated the traveler. Brother, I'll give you 50,000 levo for the mantises, and another 50,000 as down payment for future beasts. Remember me. I promise I'll give you the best price in the shelter, and I'll pay you a lot more for mutant creature flesh." Tobias handed Sen the money like it was nothing. To him, it was. Back on his home planet, this was simply the cost of a nice meal out. If this Golden Warrior was really powerful enough to kill all these mantises, there's a good chance he was hunting mutant-level creatures too, and Tobias wanted a direct line to anyone who might be willing to part with precious mutant creature flesh. It was more than worth the investment. Sen looked surprised as he took the money. "I couldn't tell you were rich." Tobias looked down at his dirty traveling clothes with shame. "You wouldn't know it from my appearance. I've been out here for a month. As soon as I get these things back to the shelter, I'm teleporting home for a nice long weekend at a 5-star retreat. I need a hot stone massage like you wouldn't believe. So, if you've got mutant flesh to sell, remember me. I'll take good care of you." "I'll keep it in mind in case I come across anything I want to unload." Sen kept his cool, but he was secretly overjoyed at Tobias's offer. "And once my Blackstone experiments start yielding results, I'll need a reliable buyer, and more importantly, a private buyer who won't attract attention. Who knows what would happen if others found out about the Black Stone?" Tobias extended his hand. "Name's Tobias West." He squirmed a little as Sen took his hand and shook it, smearing bug guts all over it. "And my room's number 1046 at the Steel Armor Shelter. What about you, brother?" Olsen Han? The guy that ripped Miss Aren's pants off? Are you ass freak?" All of the confidence and goodwill Sen had built up in the last hour evaporated. Even after donning his sacred blood armor, slaying over 40 rare and deadly beasts, and then making a deal for 100,000 levo dollars, he was still ass freak, the laughing stock of Steel Armor Shelter. "Hell, man, I can't believe this. She was just complaining about that the other day." "Man, she hates you. I'm surprised she hasn't just tracked you down and finished you off yet." "Yeah, hard to believe. But I don't really go by that name. My friends call me Sen." Tobias looked at Sen for a moment, thinking. Then he lit up. "Nah, Sen doesn't really fit this whole Golden Warrior thing you've got going on. And I'm not gonna go around town telling people I just did a deal with the ass freak for 100,000. Dollar! That's my real nickname. My friends call me Sen. My mother calls me Olsen. You can call me Dollar. And don't worry about my room number. I'll find you when I have something. Just make sure you've got your purse handy." And with that, Olsen Dollar Han headed out from the valley, leaving Tobias all alone to deal with a massive pile of carcasses. As the high of executing his first big deal faded, it hit him. "Oh man, I never captured a live lightning mantis. That was the whole point, to catch one and test out the stone." Tobias returned to the shelter with his bags full and mantis carcasses under each arm. He gathered a few friends to come with him to retrieve the rest. His friends seemed skeptical of the story Tobias told. "One guy killed 40 lightning mantises? That's BS. You really think it was just this one Golden Warrior?" Tobias responded, "Yes, I told you. I watched him. So unless you're calling me a liar and you think the lightning mantises just killed each other, can you give me another explanation?" "Must have been a gang that left him to deal with the bodies." "No way it was just one guy." Tobias could not convince them. "I'm telling you. His name was Dollar, and he was covered in a golden armor." As Sen walked away from Zephyr Valley, he still felt the adrenaline rush coursing through his veins. Not from the unholy number of back-to-back kills. He had come down from that thrill already. And not from the success of making his first ever sale, a big one at that. He was feeling the rush of changing fortunes. Not only was he sure his newfound prowess was going to save the family home, but it was also going to save his reputation. No more Ass Freak. His sacred blood armor was even stronger than he expected. 2 days ago, he struggled to fight even the weakest primitive creatures. Now he knew that lightning mantises, possibly the most lethal primitive creature with the highest offensive combat potential, couldn't even leave a mark on the golden armor plating. He smiled, never more pleased with himself. I can't believe it. I killed all of them. I just mowed right through them like they were made of paper. And their blades just bounced right off of me like, wait. He cringed as it dawned on him. I killed them all. Damn it. I knew I was forgetting something. He was supposed to capture one lightning mantis to bring back and test out the black stone on it. But he got so caught up in the fight that every mantis in the valley was now the dead and dismembered property of Tobias West. You dumbass. You went there to capture a single bug and you ended up killing all of them. How the hell are you going to test the stone out on a primitive creature now? The thought that he couldn't complete one simple task pissed him off, like he was overheating under the hard shell armor. He wished that the armor was cooler, and on command he could feel the armor expand on his body. The hard plating softened until it was almost liquid, then softer still until it was nothing but a gaseous golden shadow, which condensed and then disappeared entirely. As it vanished completely, it occurred to Sen that it might be a good idea to keep the beast's soul armor a secret. It may attract unwelcome attention and unwanted questions. He kept his eyes peeled on the long trek back towards the shelter. He still needed to find a primitive creature to try his stone on. Coppertooth panthers aren't too hard to find near town, he thought. If I just keep in this direction, I should run into at least one or two. Plus, it's not unheard of that mutant coppertooths are scattered among the primitives, so it shouldn't raise any suspicious questions if I were to show up in steel armor shelter with some mutant panther flesh. It would have some raised eyebrows if I tried to sell a mutant lightning mantis. I guess my killing spree wasn't that bad after all. No sooner had Sen calmed his nerves than he spotted a group of coppertooths roaming. 2 of them had wandered away from a larger group, and Sen figured with his armor he could overwhelm them before the others noticed. He glanced around and made sure no other hunters were tracking the coppertooths before summoning his golden armor. He clenched his fists and gritted his teeth, and an instant later, a golden fog emanated around his torso and limbs. It quickly took form and began to harden. Sen broke into a sprint, straight for the straggling coppertooths. He could feel the armor stiffen as it took on its fully formed strength. He marveled at how light it felt. He reached for his knife. The beasts spotted the golden man rushing their way and bared their fangs. Sen recalled his last fight with a coppertooth, how it evaded his attempts to slash and stab, and how even when he did land a glancing blow, his blade couldn't penetrate through its hide. So he left his knife in the sheath and lowered his shoulder. He crashed into the bigger of the pair and sent it sprawling. The second beast hissed and leapt onto Sen's back, but its claws could not penetrate the sacred blood armor. The coppertooth slid off of Sen as if he was made of ice. He careened over him and landed hard atop its large partner. Sen moved quickly, while the confused beasts were tangled up and their most vulnerable parts exposed. He grabbed his knife and brought the point down hard on the larger coppertooth's soft throat. Blood gushed, but the beast fought back. It swung at him with a heavy paw, but the blow was softened by Sen's armor. It barely moved him, like a stiff breeze. Even with the protection of his armor, he realized how lucky he was that the beast was not mutant level and far more powerful. Since the knife was his only weapon, he was forced to close quarters combat. The coppertooth was losing steam as it was losing blood. Sen easily stuck the creature again, and this time it did not fight back. It slumped to the ground and let out its last breath. Primitive coppertooth panther kill. Primitive beast soul gain. Eat the flesh of coppertooth panther to gain between 0 and 10 primitive geno points. No way! A beast soul? I killed 43 mantises and at least 100 ordinary creatures, and none of those gave me a beast soul. Now 2 beast souls in 1 week. and with my first ever primitive kill. Sen was too busy to try out the new beast soul item. He spun around, knife in hand, ready to take down the other Coppertooth. It was back on its feet and circling in behind him. Sen egged it on. "Come and get me! I dare you!" The beast reared up and sprang at him, faster than he expected, perhaps a bit overzealous. Sen didn't even try to defend. It landed its massive paws hard into his chest, and to Sen's surprise, it was a heavy impact, enough to throw off his balance. He stepped back to steady himself, right into a burrow. He tripped and fell flat on his back. The Coppertooth was on him in a flash. Its strong jaws opened wide, like a bear trap. He grabbed Sen by the head with its long fangs and chomped down with all the bite force it could muster. Without the armor, Sen's head would have been reduced to mush. But the Coppertooth couldn't even apply any pressure. Sen wrapped his arms around the beast's neck and rolled. He flipped it over and was now straddling the creature. The Coppertooth was no match. He held his knife up, about to open the beast's throat. "Wait! You need it alive!" Sen nearly got carried away in the heat of the moment again. He dropped the knife and pulled a bundle of rope from his satchel. He easily bound the Coppertooth's legs together as it wiggled around on the ground. Satisfied that the beast was unable to scurry away, he turned his attention to his newest prize. Despite being relatively weak, Coppertooth panthers were a popular hunting target for newbies in the sanctuary, because they were known to produce beast souls. It was surely a weapon of some sort, and while it wouldn't be as strong as Sen's sacred blood armor, it would put his dinky alloy knife to shame. He summoned the beast soul to his hand, where it morphed into a bronze-colored spear with a gleaming curved edge. Sen spun the weapon in his hand. He had practiced with a bow staff in integrated compulsory education, but those had been unbalanced and of poor quality. This was a beast soul weapon, and it moved through the air with grace. He hefted the weapon, which was light enough to be held in one hand, and perfectly balanced. He tested it with one finger. He couldn't wait to try it out. Unfortunately for a Coppertooth that came close to inspect what the ruckus was, Sen had just noticed it. He stared at it, as if begging it to attack, and the predator was more than happy to oblige. The Coppertooth ran towards Sen. He stood totally still, right until the moment the beast pounced. He sidestepped neatly, exhibiting his trained efficiency of movement. He spun the spear once to build momentum, then brought it down, connecting its curved head against the extended neck of the Coppertooth. He sliced clean through, removing the head from its body before the Coppertooth even felt it. Sen actually saw the Coppertooth's eye go wide in the instant after its beheading. It all happened so fast that it took the creature a moment to realize it was dead. Sen was in awe of his new possession. A longer-range weapon like the spear was far safer to use and more versatile than the $5 blade he had been using. Better yet, as a beast soul weapon, he didn't need to constantly carry it around. He could summon and unsummon it at will. He unsummoned the spear, and his armor returned to the tied-up Coppertooth. He hoisted the beast over his shoulder and began the rest of the walk back to the steel armor shelter. By the time he arrived back at the shelter gate, Sen was sweating heavily. He never realized how heavy the dead weight of a Coppertooth felt. As he drew close, a dozen well-equipped warriors proceeded out of the town gates. Each of them rode a different beast soul mount. They towered over Sen as they rode past. At the head of the group, the largest among them wore heavy steel armor and carried a blood-red glowing sword on his back. The imposing man had an imposing mount, a giant-scaled beast that looked like a triceratops. Sen did not doubt that this man was able to fell whatever monster dropped that sort of beast soul. This was the Son of Heaven, or at least that's what everyone called him, leader of one of the most fearsome gangs in the region. He was also one of the only 3 people in all of Steel Armor Shelter who was realistically attempting to complete a sacred Geno Point evolution. and word around town was that he was pretty damn close to getting there. In some respects, he was the unofficial king of the steel armor shelter, and he ruled it cruelly. Sen always thought Warlord was a better title for Son of Heaven. He tried to hide his face behind the Coppertooth Panther's body. He preferred that the Son of Heaven did not notice him. But a loud, distinguished grunt told him that he had, in fact, caught the brute's eye. Whoosh! Crack! Son of Heaven slashed down at Sen with a long leather whip. It slashed a long gash along Sen's shirt. A part of him really wanted to summon his sacred blood armor at that moment, especially a moment later when the skin under his tattered shirt seared painfully. A red welt was already forming. Who had the nerve to sell you that creature? Son of Heaven's gruff voice was cold and threatening. It was commonly understood that he was romantically interested in Sarah Arin. Unlike most women, she was far beyond his reach. She did not swoon to his cruel power. She was not afraid of him, and she could not be bought or sold. So he viewed bullying the infamous ass freak as a chance to earn her good graces. He was the biggest reason Sen had been miserable these past few months, and he showed no sign of stopping. I hunted it myself. Sen restrained any emotion in his voice. He may have a beast soul weapon and armor, but the Son of Heaven had beast souls to spare, on top of the powerful gear he kept on his person at all times. If Sen was dumb enough to engage in a fight with the Son of Heaven, he would die, almost instantly, and incredibly painfully. Besides, rumor had it that the Son of Heaven was related to very influential aristocrats. So even if Sen managed to trick or hurt him, he would likely face repercussions in the real world. Son of Heaven grunted again. If I find out that someone did sell it to you, I'll make sure you both die horribly. One of the gang lackeys, Jack Ballard, sneered at Sen. Watch your step, ass freak, or I'll end you myself. Hey, why don't we just kill him now? Sen braced himself to run. That wouldn't be a fight he could win. Because making his life miserable is way more fun. Son of Heaven sneered. I think Sarah Arin would like it. Plus, it's the strong's duty to kill the weak. I'd be honored to do it for you. Jack reached for his sword. Don't think. If she wanted him dead, he would have been axed a long time ago. Do you want her to have a grudge with the Sons of Heaven gang? Because that means she would have a grudge with me, which means I would have a grudge with you, which means... Son of Heaven slid a finger across his throat, threatening to take Jack's head. Doesn't she know that she should be honored that you're interested in her? What a silly woman. The Son of Heaven shot him a fierce look, and Jack decided to shut up before his boss did take his head off. Or worse, made him into a pariah like the ass freak. The gang turned and rode off, leaving Sen alone, needing a new shirt and thinking, I can't wait to use this stone. I'm going to harvest sacred blood Geno points and evolve into something so powerful that the Son of Heaven will piss himself whenever he hears my voice. They'll all see how strong I really am, and I'll make them regret treating the ass freak like trash. I mean, treating Olsen Dollar Han like trash. Sen returned to his room and looked at the mangled cage in the corner. Crap, forgot about that. Stupid overpowered lizard really effed up my cage. The Coppertooth Panther mewled as Sen shoved it in, and then bent the twisted and frayed wire bars back into place as best he could. This should be good enough to hold you. For now. He spoke to the Coppertooth as if it understood. Sen had such a hard time making friends in the shelter after the incident with Sarah Arin that he often found himself talking to the creatures he brought back. He summoned his new beast soul spear and used its keen edge to cut the bindings off the legs of the captured creature. Then he knelt down and pulled the black stone from its satchel. He gazed into it. The starbursts inside still sparkled brightly. He placed it on the ground, right in front of the cage. Now, how do I get you to eat a stone? The lizard was starving, but you don't look like you've missed any meals. If I had some peanut butter, I could. But before he could even begin to wonder, the coppertooth reached out with its tongue and scooped the stone up into its mouth. Well, that was easy, Sen muttered as he leaned in close to see what would happen next. Immediately, he could tell the coppertooth had a renewed energy. On the long trek back to the shelter, it had resigned itself to being captured, whimpering non-stop the last 2 hours. Sen readied himself, in case it managed to break free of the cage as the lizard had. But the bars held for the time being. It seemed like it would take time for the beast to evolve. It wasn't happening nearly as quickly as it had with the green-scale lizard. He pulled up a stool and sat in front of the cage. "A watched pot never boils, right?" he said to the creature. The coppertooth just looked back at him, wondering why this guy had dragged it here and tossed it in a cage. While he waited, Sen opened his satchel and pulled out the money Tobias West paid him. He leafed through it and thought, this was a very fortunate encounter. Talk about good timing. I hadn't seen another person all day. With Sarah Aaron and Son of Heaven scaring away my potential buyers, I was lucky to find anyone in Steel Armor Shelter willing to do business with me. I just hope Tobias doesn't tell anyone else who I am. Sen grew bored of sitting and staring at the coppertooth panther, who seemed to be napping now. So he decided it was a good time to practice with his new spear. In the confined space, he had to be careful how he swung it. But that made his work that much more effective. He spent the next hours jabbing, spinning, slashing, summoning, and unsummoning. By the time he realized he was drenched in sweat and breathing heavily, he felt confident that he could take on a moderately skilled opponent in an enclosed area. He looked back at the coppertooth and noticed something. Its fur, which had been gray-black like all primitive coppertooths, had gained a sort of luster it didn't have before. As it moved, the light reflected off its fur, giving it a dark bronze hue. Its fangs, too, were brightening. Clearly, the stone had started taking effect, but far more slowly than it had with the ordinary green-scale lizard. Sen took a mental note. It seems that an evolution from ordinary to primitive comes about much faster than primitive to mutant. I've seen mutant coppertooth panthers, and they've got much lighter fur, and their fangs are almost luminous. This one is only a small part of the way there. At this pace, it might take more than a day. That means I have to be prepared at all times, though. If this coppertooth reaches mutant level and takes me by surprise, it could kill me before I even got to teleport home and buy the house off my greedy aunt and uncle. Then what will happen to my poor mother and Yara? Sen's thoughts always returned to his mother and sister. He never forgot that, even though he came to this sanctuary to make something out of himself, and maybe to prove to himself he was capable of overcoming his real-life circumstances, that he was also now the man of the family. Everything he was doing was to help them. And so he waited. He had just enough lizard jerky to last 2 very sparse and hungry days. With his armor and spear, it felt like a waste eating something that no longer gave him Geno points. But he had to eat. Eat up, Furball. He threw scraps to the coppertooth inside the cage as he ate, and he almost felt like he was forming a bond with the bloodthirsty creature. Especially since he had spoken to the beast more in 2 days than he had anyone in all of Steel Armor Shelter in months. 2 days later, and out of jerky, Sen emerged from his quarters and found that the shelter was far less crowded than usual. What's going on? He ambled through the market and realized no one had pointed at him or mocked him to his face. I wonder if Tobias told people about my epic mantis slaughter. Maybe word got out that I'm not such a joke after all. Ass freak, someone he'd never even seen before muttered at him as they passed on the street. I guess word hasn't gotten out. But something was going on. Normally, he would have had a dozen people mutter something rude or point and laugh by now. The atmosphere was tense. Eventually, he gleaned what was happening by eavesdropping on hushed conversations. A couple days ago, someone had spotted a sacred blood creature near Sunset Slope. Sen couldn't make out what kind of beast, but the creature sounded especially vicious and especially valuable. All three local gangs rushed out, each attempting to down the creature for themselves. However, they were hasty, in a rush to not lose a golden opportunity to someone faster. Without coordination and planning, they walked right into the lion's den, unprepared for what they found. They didn't stand a chance. The creature obliterated them. No one knew yet how many had died, but it was a lot. Naturally, the gang bosses and their top lieutenants were safe in the back. They sent in their foot soldiers and the new kids who just arrived in the sanctuary and were looking to make a name for themselves. After losing most of their lower ranks, all three gang bosses, Sarah Aaron, Son of Heaven, and Deadly Fist, came together and reached an agreement. The three gangs would attempt to work together to bring the creature down. They also sent out recruitment officers to Steel Armor Shelter to gather up ambitious lone wolves, smaller groups, and any kid capable of holding a blade. Sen could hardly believe it. The creature must be incredibly powerful for Son of Heaven, who already had sacred blood beast soul weapons, to agree to team up. He was not a team player, not when it came to sacred blood geno points and evolution, not even with Sarah Aaron. It would require utmost speed and very lucky timing to defeat a creature like that. I have been on a lucky streak, he thought. Despite the countless deaths and the prospect of running headfirst into Sarah Aaron and Son of Heaven, Sen rushed out of the city. Once he was out of view from the shelter, he summoned his golden beast soul armor. Instead of slowing him down, the brilliant metal actually quickened his steps. He moved like a graceful golden shadow over the landscape. At a distance, it was a sight to behold. Up close, Sen was huffing and puffing, a dripping sweat. I really need to get a beast soul mount like Son of Heaven, he thought. After an hour of non-stop running, the ground began to pitch upwards. He had arrived at the western edge of the Sunset Slope. There was a rocky hill overlooking the slope, and Sen began to climb. The work was exhausting, but he would not let himself rest. With each handhold and push, he repeated, I have to make it. I have to get there in time. Finally, he reached the top. The sight below him was staggering. Sunset Slope had turned into a battlefield, a very bloody battlefield. Hundreds of exhausted and battered warriors milled about, and at least 100 more lay scattered, dead and dismembered. It made sense now that the death toll was uncertain. There were different parts of different people spread out all over the slope. What was normally a warm, sun-washed slope was now shined red and slick with blood. Sen couldn't even find the sacred blood beast in the mess and chaos spread out across the slope. Then a large group of men, huddled in the center of the scrum, seemed to explode outward, toppling back. The lucky ones landed on their companions. The unlucky ones, flung high in the air, landed with sickening cracks and crunches that could be heard all the way to where Sen stood. But he didn't react to the men soaring through the air, or the broken bodies that hit the ground. His eyes were fixed on the beast. It emerged, roaring from the mass of warriors, hefting a massive double-edged golden battle axe. It swung the axe in a wide arc, cleaving the warriors around him. It slashed one man in midair, leaving only a red mist. It was a grotesque mishmash of beings, the head of a bull, body of a man, and legs of a horse. Its roar was that of a lion, and its ferocity was unmatched by anything Sen could have ever imagined. It charged through the crowd, parting it like a ship parts water. When it swung its axe, the swing didn't even slow as it drove through multiple warriors each time. Sen saw that it was charging at Son of Heaven, who had somehow gotten its attention in the chaos. Although Sen hated Son of Heaven, he had to admit The gang boss looked powerful and fierce as he rode his Triceratops-like beast soul mount and held his blood-red sword aloft, like a mythical hero. One could almost believe that Son of Heaven could take the beast on by himself. That illusion was shattered when the sacred blood monster broke into a gallop towards him, and Sen could see just how much the beast towered over the man. The sacred blood creature lifted its axe to strike him, and Son of Heaven seemed to realize that he would die if he attempted to block the blow. He dove off his mount, and the axe split the Triceratops mount in two like it was nothing. Son of Heaven screamed in anguish as the two halves of his precious mount collapsed on the ground. Sen could hardly believe his eyes. How is this sacred blood creature so strong? It moved too quickly for anyone to land anything more than a glancing blow. What's worse, its hide was evidently incredibly strong. Arrows and spears bounced off its massive body like pebbles. Sen watched Sarah Arin desperately try to corral her people. He couldn't hear her from where he stood, but he could see she was ordering her warriors to spread out so they did not fall to a single swing of the creature's massive axe. Is this what most sacred blood beasts are like? He thought back to the sacred blood beetle he had found. It was nothing like this. That beetle had no combat abilities at all, a far cry from this monster on the battlefield. I guess the black stone evolutions don't fully upgrade the power of the creatures it affects, he noted gladly. Thank God for that. I'd hate to return to my quarters to find another one of these things waiting for me. Just then, the sacred blood creature bolted towards the mountain, forcing warriors to dive out of the way. Son of Heaven bellowed, and Sen could barely make out the words. Trap it! Trap it, damn you! It's trying to escape! Son of Heaven pushed a nearby warrior off of her wildebeest mount and charged ahead. He lifted a massive green iron bow, and in his other hand a glowing shadow briefly swirled into the shape of a giant six-winged wasp, and then became a fiery beast soul arrow. A sacred blood beast's soul arrow. Sen could sense its power from here. Everyone on the battlefield gawked at the Son of Heaven. Many had been present at the hunt for the six-winged wasp. The Son of Heaven had landed the final blow, and this was his mighty prize. Many were aware that this arrow had special properties. It was incredibly powerful, but could be used only once. Son of Heaven didn't hesitate. He drew his bow back and fired. The arrow streaked into a red shock of lightning, moving through the air with impossible speed towards the axe-wielding sacred blood creature. The arrow found its target with a thundering crack that seemed to shake the mountain. The beast was struck squarely in the back. Its legs buckled as it ran, and its momentum sent a tidal wave of earth into the air as it smashed into the dirt. You think you could kill me? Son of Heaven screamed at the monster as he sped forward on his stolen mount. I'll destroy you! Across the battlefield, Sarah Arin scowled as Son of Heaven rode in to deliver the killing blow and collect the prize. Typical, she muttered her disapproval. He's never going to shut up about this. I've never seen anything like this before. Tobias stood alongside her, his mouth agape. Suddenly, a golden flash coursed through the air. A mysterious figure shot downwards out of the sky and landed directly atop the felled sacred blood creature. What the hell was that? Sarah squinted, unsure of what she was seeing. Tobias rubbed his eyes. To be sure, he was really seeing what he recognized as... Wait, is that... Dollar?